He was the king of Chicago real estate, a billionaire admired across America. His wife was 7 months pregnant, glowing with pride, certain their future was secure. But in one reckless night, he chose another woman and shattered everything. 20 years later, the son he abandoned rose to become the youngest billionaire in the country, while the father who filed for divorce ended up alone, broke, and forgotten. The betrayal that started in luxury ended in bitter tears. Before we dive into this unforgettable story of love, betrayal, heartbreak, and shocking redemption, take a moment to support us. If you love powerful dramas filled with twists and emotions, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more. Hit the like button if you're ready for the journey. Leave a comment to share your thoughts as the story unfolds. We want to know your reactions. And most importantly, don't keep this drama to yourself. Share it with friends and family who enjoy deep, emotional storytelling. Now, let's begin the story. Nathaniel Nate Harrington was 43 years old, standing at the top of his glass empire in downtown Chicago. From his penthouse office, he could see Lake Michigan shimmering under the morning sun. People called him ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable. At home, his wife Alyssa, 36, was 7 months pregnant with their first child. She was a quiet power behind his success, the strategist who polished his dreams into billion-dollar realities. Together, they were the couple everyone admired. But inside Nate's chest, ambition had turned to restlessness, and temptation lurked closer than he dared admit. Alyssa moved gracefully through their mansion on Lakeshore Drive, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. She carried herself with a calm strength that made boardrooms bow and investors listen. Everyone believed she was the luckiest woman alive, married to a billionaire, living in luxury, preparing to welcome a child. Yet, Alyssa's instinct told her something was wrong. Nate had been distant, distracted, smiling less. She remembered when his eyes used to light up at the sight of her. Now those eyes wandered. She refused to admit out loud, but deep down, she knew betrayal was near. Nate's life looked perfect in glossy magazines, the lavish galas, the high-rise offices, the tailored suits. But behind the photographs, cracks were spreading. His new assistant, Chloe Whitaker, 29, had entered his world like a whisper of freedom. She wasn't brilliant like Alyssa, nor respected by the city's elite, but Chloe knew how to make him feel powerful without effort. She laughed at his jokes, stroked his ego, and never reminded him of responsibilities waiting at home. Her presence was intoxicating, reminding him of youth, of choices without consequences. Alyssa, meanwhile, prepared carefully for the company's annual gala. The Drake Hotel ballroom would be filled with Chicago's elite, judges, investors, politicians, and business tycoons. For years, she and Nate had been the city's power couple, commanding admiration everywhere they went. At 36, Alyssa still carried the elegance of a queen. She wore a midnight blue gown that highlighted her glow, determined to represent their family's future with dignity. But as she fastened her necklace in the mirror, her heart whispered warnings. She wanted to believe Nate would stand proudly by her side. She didn't yet know he planned betrayal. The gala opened with crystal chandeliers shimmering over sea of tuxedos and gowns. Laughter and champagne filled the air as cameras flashed at arriving dignitaries. Nate entered, tall and commanding in a tailored black suit, Chloe following closely behind, her red dress stealing every eye. Whispers spread quickly. Why was his assistant walking so close? Alyssa's smile didn't falter as she greeted partners, but she noticed. She noticed everything. She walked forward to take Nate's hand, but he stepped past her, his eyes fixed on Chloe. The moment sliced her heart in two. The master of ceremonies called Nate to the stage. With thousands watching, he began a speech meant to celebrate the company's record year. But halfway through, his words veered. His voice slurred slightly, weighted with too much scotch. "Perfection is exhausting," he announced. The room stiffened, confused. He gestured to Alyssa, then paused dramatically. "My wife. She's brilliant, perfect, everything a man should want. But I found something real." He turned his gaze toward Chloe, his smile widening. "The truth is, I can't keep living a lie." Alyssa's legs trembled, but she stood tall. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Phones appeared, capturing every second of the scandal unfolding live. Alyssa's face burned under the weight of hundreds of eyes. Her heart pounded as Nate reached for Chloe's hand, holding it boldly in front of Chicago's elite. Alyssa thought of the child kicking inside her belly, innocent and undeserving of this public humiliation. She whispered to herself, steadying her breath, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The camera snapped furiously, flashing like lightning. Nate's announcement spread across social media before the night ended. Billionaire dumps pregnant wife for assistant. Headlines screamed by morning. Alyssa sat alone in her room, gown draped over a chair, makeup streaked by silent tears. She placed a trembling hand on her stomach, whispering to her unborn child, "I'll protect you. I'll rebuild, even if I have to start from nothing." Her voice broke, but her resolve hardened. Meanwhile, Nate slept soundly beside Chloe in a luxury suite, convinced he had won his freedom. The next morning, sunlight poured into the Harrington mansion, but warmth no longer lived there. Alyssa packed a small suitcase, leaving behind the marble floors, the gold chandeliers, and the life she built. The driver hesitated as she stepped into the car. "Where to, Mrs. Harrington?" he asked softly. She wiped her eyes, her voice firm. "Just drive, anywhere but here." In that moment, Alyssa left behind not just wealth, but illusions. She carried only her unborn child and the strength of a broken heart. Nate watched from the balcony, unmoved, believing he'd traded burdens for freedom. As Alyssa disappeared down the driveway, Chloe leaned against Nate with a sly smile. "It's just us now," she whispered. Nate kissed her forehead, mistaking conquest for love. But deep inside, a whisper of doubt lingered. Business partners began calling, disapproving of his public scandal. Investors withdrew from deals, worried about stability. Nate waved them off, too proud to admit weakness. To him, Chloe was a fresh start, a reminder of youth. But to the world, he was now a man who betrayed his pregnant wife. The cracks in his empire had begun, though he refused to see them. 2 weeks later, Alyssa rented a modest one-bedroom apartment near the University of Chicago. The walls were bare, the carpet worn, but it was hers. She balanced a notebook on her belly, sketching plans for her consulting firm. "We'll build a future, Logan," she whispered to her unborn child. Nate flaunted Chloe at rooftop bars, dismissing investors' concerns. Alyssa saved every penny, determined to transform pain into purpose. As Nate sank into indulgence, Alyssa tightened her focus, preparing for the life she'd promised her child. Every breath was fuel for resilience. The divorce papers arrived in a thick envelope, Nate's signature bold across the top. Alyssa's hand trembled, but she refused tears. "He chose this path," she whispered. Nate celebrated the finality, blind to how investors recoil from his scandal. Alyssa filed them away, her mind racing toward opportunity. She pitched her first client at a coffee shop, belly shifting as Logan stretched inside her. Across town, Chloe decorated Nate's mansion with gaudy purchases, each swipe of his card cutting deeper into his fortune. Alyssa's freedom was grit. Nate's was chaos without direction. 2 months later, hospital room. The delivery was grueling. Hours of labor broke Alyssa's body, but not her spirit. At dawn, the cries of baby Logan filled the sterile room. He weighed just over 6 pounds, tiny yet strong, his eyes curious even then. Alyssa, exhausted, kissed his forehead. "You will never be abandoned," she whispered. Across town, Nate raised a glass of whiskey with Chloe, oblivious that his son had been born. The nurse smiled warmly, whispering, "He's perfect." Alyssa nodded, tears streaming, knowing her real empire had begun. Back in her small apartment, Alyssa rocked Logan in a second-hand crib, balancing spreadsheets with her free hand. Exhaustion pressed heavily, yet her determination grew stronger. She pitched Aurora Strategies, her new firm, between midnight feedings. Her first small contract came from a local startup desperate for guidance. Meanwhile, Nate ignored mounting warning signs. Chloe's spending spree swallowed millions, from designer jewelry to flashy cars. At 44, he called himself invincible, yet credibility slipped daily. Alyssa delivered stellar results, earning her first referral. Nate dismissed calls from anxious board members, drowning in denial and arrogance. 6 months later, Aurora Strategy secured a second client, then a third. Alyssa, 37, juggled late-night research with early morning feedings. Logan's coups filling the room. She reinvested every cent, slowly hiring her first assistant. Across town, Nate's partners grew restless, questioning Chloe's constant presence at board meetings. He silenced them with arrogance, ignoring the decline in profits. Chloe smirked from her seat, whispering, "They'll get used to me." Alyssa filed taxes herself, learning every detail of business survival. Nate hosted another lavish party, blind to the foundation crumbling beneath his expensive shoes. 3 years passed. Alyssa, now 40, stood tall at conferences, Logan, 3, holding her hand. Her firm had grown into a respected name across Chicago. Logan charmed professionals with his curiosity, absorbing every lesson. Nate, 47, looked older, drained by Chloe's endless demands. Harrington Global lost contracts as rivals seized opportunities. Alyssa signed multi-year deals, securing stability. Logan's laughter filled their modest but warm home. Nate's mansion felt colder, echoing with emptiness even during parties. Alyssa carved resilience into hers. Nate carved regret into his. Logan's future was bright, though his father refused to see. 10 years later, Logan, 13, stood on stage at a robotics competition, dazzling judges with his invention. Alyssa cheered proudly from the front row. Aurora Strategies had become a multi-million-dollar consultancy, trusted nationwide. Nate looked haggard, gray streaks marking stress. Chloe had siphoned much of his fortune into overseas accounts, though he pretended not to notice. Alyssa invested carefully, ensuring Logan had every resource to grow. Neighbors admired their bond, calling Logan prodigy. Nate's empire collapsed piece by piece, yet he clung to illusions of control that no longer existed. At 14, Logan received a scholarship to an elite academy. Alyssa balanced her pride with caution, reminding him that humility mattered more than wealth. Meanwhile, Nate's empire was nearly gone. Chloe disappeared one night, leaving only a note and unpaid bills. He searched for her in desperation, realizing she had drained him dry. Alone, Nate sold cars and jewelry to survive. Alyssa, however, expanded Aurora Strategies to New York, guiding Fortune 500 companies. Logan shadowed her meetings, absorbing wisdom that would soon define his future. Nate wept silently in empty halls. 5 years later, Logan, 19, launched a startup from his dorm room, dazzling investors with his sharp mind and vision. Alyssa proudly supported him, though she warned against reckless ambition. The company skyrocketed, and Logan became the youngest CEO in his university's history. Nate lived in a cramped apartment, flipping through old photos of Alyssa and toddler Logan. He whispered, "What have I done?" to walls that never answered. Alyssa and Logan celebrated milestones, laughter echoing through conference halls. Nate listened from afar, broken, realizing his greatest empire had walked out 20 years ago. By 20, Logan was a billionaire. Tech magazines called him a genius. Fortune named him youngest billionaire in America. Alyssa stood beside him at galas, radiant with pride. Reporters often asked about his father. Logan always deflected, saying, "My mother taught me everything." Nate wandered the streets near Logan's events, watching from shadows, tears staining his cheeks. Chloe was long gone, his fortune squandered. Alyssa smiled on stage, knowing she had rebuilt from nothing. Nate finally understood the weight of choices made decades ago, when he abandoned love for fleeting temptation. 1 year later, Logan, now 21, was on the cover of Forbes, his confident smile capturing America's admiration. Investors called him the future of technology, while Alyssa quietly managed his growing influence. Logan often credited his mother publicly, saying, "She's my foundation." Nate, hidden in the crowd at events, listened to those words with a hollow heart. He wanted to reach out, but shame held him back. Logan shook hands with presidents and billionaires, but his father remained a ghost on the sidelines, watching what could have been his proudest legacy slip away forever. Logan expanded his company into renewable energy, gaining praise as a visionary. The world admired his humility and sharp intellect. Nate watched interviews on an old television, tears rolling down his face. He whispered to himself, "That's my boy," but the words carried no weight. Logan avoided questions about his father, focusing instead on honoring his mother. Alyssa stood proudly at his side, reminding him to remain grounded. Nate's regret grew heavier each day, realizing he had traded his pride for fleeting moments with Chloe, who had long abandoned him without remorse. 2 years later, at 23, Logan bought back the Harrington Mansion, his childhood home that Nate had sold years earlier in desperation. Cameras flashed as he walked through grand halls, his mother at his side. Reporters called it a son's redemption. Nate, living in a shabby apartment, saw the headlines and broke down, gripping the newspaper with shaking hands. Logan renovated the mansion, turning it into his headquarters. Alyssa smiled as she watched him reclaim what had been lost. Nate, outside the gates one evening, whispered, "I don't belong here anymore," before walking away. Logan's empire grew international, his name recognized in Tokyo, London, and Dubai. His wisdom impressed world leaders, who marveled at how a man so young carried himself with maturity beyond his years. Meanwhile, Nate wandered the streets of Chicago, begging old colleagues for work, but doors slammed in his face. Alyssa stood proudly at Logan's side as he gave keynote speeches, his words inspiring millions. Nate, unshaven and weary, watched his son on a television through a store window, choking back sobs. Every achievement Logan celebrated deepened the sorrow buried in Nate's soul. Logan's 24th birthday. Logan's gala was filled with governors, tech moguls, and celebrities. Alyssa beamed as he gave a heartfelt speech thanking her for sacrifice and love. "This empire exists because of my mother," he said, bringing the audience to tears. Outside, Nate stood at the gates, watching the bright lights. He had not been invited, and his shame grew unbearable. Logan laughed with friends inside, unaware his father lingered outside, desperate for one more chance. Nate turned away into the night, haunted by the ghost of the family he had destroyed 2 decades earlier. At 25, Logan announced a massive philanthropic foundation, pledging billions to education and innovation. The media hailed him as a leader of his generation, not just in wealth but in character. Alyssa was at his side, her eyes shimmering with pride. Nate, watching the televised event from a soup kitchen, whispered brokenly, "He's everything I dreamed of without me." Logan cut the ribbon to thunderous applause, but he never once looked for his father. Nate bowed his head, knowing the world celebrated his son's light, while he drowned in the shadows of regret. Logan's first billion-dollar IPO. The stock market floor roared as Logan, 26, rang the opening bell. Confetti rained down, reporters shouted questions, and the world hailed him as a once-in-a-century genius. Alyssa embraced him, whispering, "Your father's choices don't define you." Across town, Nate slumped in a dingy bar, watching the celebration replay on a cracked TV screen. Nate raised a glass of cheap whiskey, muttering, "That's my boy," before breaking down in sobs. Logan's empire soared to new heights. While Nate's life sank into an abyss he could no longer escape. At 27, Logan was honored at the White House for his contributions to technology and philanthropy. Standing at the podium, he thanked his mother once more, his voice steady and proud. The president called him the pride of a generation. Alyssa smiled, tears in her eyes. Nate, now a shadow of himself, watched the broadcast from a crowded shelter. He reached out toward the screen, whispering Logan's name, but the son could not hear. The chasm between them was too wide. The applause in Washington drowned out the silence of Nate's forgotten existence. Logan's 28th year. Logan purchased a skyscraper in downtown Chicago, renaming it Aurora Tower after his mother's firm. The dedication ceremony drew thousands, Alyssa cutting the ribbon with pride. Logan declared, "This is for my mother, who showed me what true strength looks like." The crowd erupted in cheers. Nate, weak and frail, wandered nearby, but couldn't bring himself to step forward. Logan stood tall on the stage, honoring Alyssa's sacrifices. Nate shuffled down the street, whispering apologies to no one, realizing the world had permanently erased his name from the legacy he abandoned. At 29, Logan was named Person of the Year by Time magazine. The cover showed him beside Alyssa, both glowing with triumph. They were the family Nate had destroyed, but also the family that rose stronger without him. Nate, homeless and forgotten, clutched the magazine someone had discarded, staring at the faces he once called his own. Logan's empire was unstoppable, his bond with Alyssa unbreakable. Nate collapsed on a park bench, sobbing as the wind carried the whispers of a past he could never change. His downfall was complete, his punishment eternal. A rainy evening, the city skyline glistened under storm as Logan prepared for another international launch. Alyssa stood behind him, calm yet proud, reminding him of his roots. "Never forget who you are," she whispered. Logan nodded, his resolve firm. Meanwhile, Nate sat drenched on a park bench, shivering, watching limousines pass by. In those headlights, he imagined the life he had thrown away. Logan's empire expanded into healthcare and technology, his influence undeniable. Nate's name had become a cautionary tale, whispered in business schools about betrayal, greed, and the cost of abandoning the ones who matter. At another charity gala, Logan addressed an audience filled with global leaders and celebrities. He spoke passionately about creating opportunities for young innovators, his words striking like thunder. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, Alyssa's eyes shimmering with tears. Outside, Nate lingered in the shadows, staring through glass as his son embraced dignitaries. His hands trembled against the cold, his reflection a ghost against the warm light inside. Logan smiled confidently on stage, unaware of the figure watching from the darkness, a father too ashamed to step forward and face his mistakes. Downtown Chicago, billboards across Michigan Avenue flashed Logan's face, celebrating his latest billion-dollar acquisition. Alyssa drove past them, pride swelling, though her heart ached for the boy who once held her hand in that tiny apartment. Nate stumbled through the same streets, ignored by passers-by, bitterly watching the city worship his son. Logan's rise mirrored Nate's fall with haunting symmetry. Alyssa remembered the night she left her mansion with nothing but resolve. Now her son owned more than Nate ever dreamed of. For Nate, every flashing billboard was another reminder of a legacy that slipped away. Inside Aurora Tower, Logan convened with his executive board, discussing expansion into space technology. Alyssa listened quietly, admiring how her son commanded respect without arrogance. Nate, miles away, argued with a landlord threatening eviction. He offered promises he couldn't keep, clutching memories of power he once wielded. Logan shook hands with partners, securing billion-dollar commitments. Nate curled up on a thin mattress, gnawed by hunger, wondering if Logan even remembered him. The contrast was stark. One building an empire for the future, the other crushed under the ruins of a past that could never return. An exclusive interview. A journalist asked Logan about the secret to his success. He paused and said, "Everything I am comes from my mother. She never gave up, even when life broke her." Alyssa's smile in the front row was radiant. The audience applauded warmly. Nate watched the interview from a diner corner, his hands trembling over a cold cup of coffee. Not once did Logan mention him. Nate's throat tightened, his regrets multiplying. He realized too late that the world had already written the story, without his name, without his presence. Logan's innovations changed how millions lived, bringing him global recognition. Schools taught his strategies. Children idolized his achievements, and governments sought his counsel. Alyssa stood proudly beside him, honored as a guiding hand behind his empire. Nate drifted through shelters, reduced to whispers about the man he once was. Logan kept his gaze forward, too focused to look back at the wreckage left by his father. Alyssa sometimes wondered if forgiveness was possible, but Nate had never reached out. His pride was now his prison, and the walls had no escape. A winter morning, snow blanketed Chicago as Logan's company unveiled a revolutionary clean energy breakthrough. Crowds filled Grant Park to witness history. Alyssa stood close, wrapped warmly, smiling at the boy who had become a leader. Cameras flashed endlessly. Just blocks away, Nate huddled near a fire barrel, watching the distant lights of celebration. He whispered Logan's name into the night, his breath visible in the freezing air. But Logan didn't hear, too consumed by shaping the future. The father who abandoned him was now just another forgotten figure drifting in the cold. Logan's company expanded into education, building schools across America. At ribbon-cutting ceremonies, children cheered his name, calling him a hero. Alyssa's pride grew deeper with every project. Nate, meanwhile, searched for odd jobs to survive, sweeping floors in warehouses where nobody knew his past. Logan's face adorned magazines, praised as a visionary. Nate's name disappeared into obscurity, even among those who once admired him. He longed to stand beside his son just once, but the wall of time and choices loomed too high. His silence had sealed his permanent exile. Logan's global summit. World leaders filled a hall in New York, eager to hear Logan outline strategies for future technology. Alyssa sat in the front row, radiant with pride. Cameras broadcasted his speech worldwide. Nate watched from a small television in a shelter, surrounded by people who barely listened. Tears streamed down his face as Logan spoke of resilience, determination, and sacrifice. Nate clutched the screen, whispering apologies that never reached their target. In the eyes of the world, Logan was untouchable, while Nate was just another forgotten man in the crowd. The summit ended with roaring applause, Logan embracing Alyssa on stage. The image spread globally, a mother and son, unbreakable, unstoppable. Nate wandered aimlessly, hearing strangers discuss Logan with awe. Every word pierced his soul. He realized his son had become the man he once dreamed of being. But without him, Alyssa whispered to Logan afterward, "Your father's choices don't define your legacy." Logan nodded, determined to move forward. Nate collapsed on a sidewalk bench, sobbing uncontrollably, knowing the world will remember his son, but forget him forever. Late evening, the city glowed with lights as Logan returned to the mansion he had reclaimed years earlier. Alyssa sat by the fire, reflecting on the long journey. Logan joined her, saying softly, "I sometimes wonder about him." She placed a hand on his, replying, "Some questions don't need answers." Meanwhile, Nate shuffled past the gates outside, staring at the golden glow of the home he once owned. He pressed his forehead against the cold iron bars, whispering his son's name before slipping back into the darkness that had become his permanent companion. Logan launched a new innovation hub, giving scholarships to underprivileged students. Thousands applied, calling him an inspiration. Alyssa's eyes filled with pride as she watched young dreamers find hope. Nate, however, stood in line at a shelter, receiving a tray of food with shaking hands. He overheard men praising Logan's generosity, each word slicing deeper into his soul. Nate once had power to change lives, but he had chosen betrayal. Now his son carried that torch, and the father who abandoned him was left in the cold, living off scraps of forgotten glory. Another winter storm. Snow fell heavily as Logan prepared to unveil his largest project yet, a global initiative to end energy poverty. World leaders gathered to witness history. Alyssa clasped his hand, whispering, "This is your moment." Across the city, Nate stumbled through icy streets, clutching his chest from the cold. He stopped in front of a store window, watching Logan's speech on television. Tears froze on Nate's cheeks as his son received a standing ovation from leaders worldwide. He whispered, "I'm proud of you," though the boy who needed to hear it wasn't listening. Inside the packed arena, Logan's words echoed like thunder. "We rise not by what we inherit, but by what we build." The crowd erupted, chanting his name. Alyssa stood at his side, knowing her sacrifices had been worth every moment. Nate leaned against the glass outside, shivering, pressing his palm to the window, as if reaching for the son he'd abandoned decades earlier. Logan bowed his head in gratitude, but not the man outside. For Nate, every cheer was a dagger, reminding him he had traded legacy for temporary pleasure. Days later, Logan was honored with an award recognizing him as one of the most influential figures in the world. Cameras flashed as he embraced Alyssa, their bond undeniable. Nate sat hunched on a nearby street corner, hearing strangers speak about the ceremony. He lowered his head, ashamed to admit he was the man they pitted. Logan stood on stage, declaring, "This is just the beginning." Nate repeated the words quietly, a hollow echo. His empire was gone, his mistress gone, his wealth gone. All that remained was the silence of regret. Logan continued building schools, hospitals, and innovation hubs worldwide, becoming a symbol of resilience. Alyssa, though older, walked beside him proudly at every milestone. Nate, weakened and frail, sat on a bench near the river, replaying memories of when Alyssa was pregnant, when he chose Chloe, when he filed for divorce. Each memory stung sharper than the last. He wanted to beg forgiveness, but courage failed him. Logan's name was immortalized in history books, while Nate's was erased. His downfall was complete, the consequences of arrogance carved permanently into his lonely existence. A quiet night. The Harrington mansion glowed with music and laughter as Logan hosted a celebration for his latest achievement. Guests toasted to his brilliance. Alyssa smiled warmly, and the world celebrated their bond. Outside, Nate lingered once again, hearing echoes of joy through the walls. He pressed his hands against the gate, trembling, whispering apologies into the cold night air. Inside, Logan raised his glass to his mother, declaring her his greatest inspiration. Outside, Nate sank to ground, tears mixing with dirt, realizing the life he had chosen could never be undone. Logan gave interviews about his journey, always crediting Alyssa's sacrifices. "She taught me strength," he said, his voice steady. Reporters asked about his father, but Logan simply replied, "I learned what not to be." Those words spread worldwide, piercing Nate's heart like glass. Alyssa gently touched Logan's arm, proud yet sorrowful for the void that could never be filled. Nate sat in his shelter, the broadcast echoing in the background, tears streaming down his weathered face. He realized forgiveness was no longer possible. His name was erased, his legacy rewritten without his presence. The final years. Logan's empire became global, his name etched into history. Alyssa lived to see her son's greatness blossom fully, her sacrifices crowned in triumph. Nate, frail and forgotten, wandered the streets like a ghost. People whispered about him, unaware he was a man who once owned skyscrapers. He passed by Aurora Tower one last time, gazing up at the name his son had made legendary. His chest tightened with sorrow, realizing the tower could have carried his name too, if only he had chosen love over temptation. But now it was far too late. The story closed with two images: Logan, standing proud beside Alyssa, celebrated as a visionary, and Nate, broken on a lonely bench, drowning in regret. The man who once filed for divorce lost everything: his fortune, his mistress, his family. His son, the child he abandoned, became the youngest billionaire in America, building an empire stronger than anything his father had imagined. Alyssa's eyes shone with quiet victory. Logan's legacy soared, while Nate's name faded into dust. The world remembered the son and the mother, but never the father who chose betrayal over love.